Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano. The name alone sent shivers through the underworld. He was the underboss of the Gambino Crime Family, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. He killed 19 men, he earned millions, and he lived by a code, omerta, the sacred vow of silence that every made man swore to keep. But in 1991, Sammy did the unthinkable. He broke that code. He testified against his boss, the infamous John Gotti, the Dapper Don, the most famous mobster since Al Capone. Sammy's testimony put Gotti away for life, and in exchange, Sammy walked free. After admitting to 19 murders, he served less than 5 years. The government gave him a new identity, a new life. Witness protection in Arizona, far from New York, far from the mob, far from his past. He was supposed to disappear, live quietly, stay out of trouble. But Sammy Gravano wasn't built for quiet. Within a few years, the most notorious turncoat in Mafia history would build a criminal empire more profitable than anything he'd done with the mob. An Ecstasy distribution network that flooded the Southwest with millions of pills made him a millionaire all over again, and proved that once a gangster, always a gangster. This is the story of Sammy the Bull Gravano, the man who betrayed the Mafia and couldn't betray his own nature. A story of loyalty, betrayal, greed, and the price of trying to outrun your past. March 12th, 1945. Brooklyn, New York. Salvatore Gravano was born into a world where the Mafia wasn't just crime, it was culture. It was respect. It was power. Growing up in Bensonhurst, young Sammy watched the wise guys, the men in expensive suits, the men who commanded respect, who walked with confidence, who had money and muscle. Sammy was different from other kids. He was tough. He was loyal. He was a fighter. But he also had something else, a mind for business, a strategic thinker. While other street thugs were muscle, Sammy understood the game. He understood that respect was earned and power was seized. By his 20s, Sammy was a made man in the Gambino family, working under Paul Castellano, Big Paul. The boss of bosses, Sammy ran construction rackets, loan sharking operations. He was good at it, very good. He made money, he made connections, and he earned a reputation as someone you didn't cross. But in the mob, survival isn't about loyalty. It's about reading the game. And in 1985, Sammy read it perfectly. When John Gotti orchestrated the hit on Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, Sammy sided with Gotti, a decision that would make him and eventually break him. Under Gotti, Sammy became underboss, the number 2 man in the most powerful crime family in America. While Gotti loved the spotlight, the media, the attention, Sammy preferred the shadows. He was the muscle, the enforcer, the problem solver. Together, They were unstoppable. The FBI estimated Sammy was earning $10 million a year. Not bad for a kid from Bensonhurst, but the FB was closing in, and John Gotti's love of attention was bringing heat. Too much heat. The government had them under surveillance. They had recordings. They had evidence. And eventually, they had enough to bring them both down. December 1990. FBI agents arrested John Gotti and Sammy Gravano. The charges were racketeering, murder, conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Hours of recordings, Gotti's voice on tape, ordering hits, discussing crimes, celebrating murders, and on those tapes, Gotti said something that would seal his fate. He blamed Sammy. On the tapes, Gotti criticized Sammy, questioned his loyalty, talked about him behind his back. Gotti was willing to sacrifice Sammy to save himself. When Sammy heard those tapes, something inside him broke. The loyalty, the code, the brotherhood, it was all a lie. Sammy's attorney brought him a choice. Take the fall with Gotti, life in prison, or maybe the death penalty, or cooperate. Tell the government everything, testify against Gotti, and walk away. For most mobsters, this wasn't even a question. You die before you rat. But Sammy wasn't most mobsters. He was a businessman. And this was a business decision. November 1991. Sammy the Bull Gravano stood in federal court, and for 9 days, he told them everything. He described 19 murders. He detailed the structure of the Gambino family. He explained how they operated, how they made money, how they killed, and most importantly, he testified against John Gotti. The testimony was devastating. Sammy was articulate, credible, detailed. The jury believed every word. And on April 2nd, 1992, ins Avanshi Awasisaridian Ma Imten or Day One Wire. John Gotti was convicted, sentenced to life in prison without parole. He would die behind bars. The Teflon Don, brought down by his own underboss. The Mafia was shocked, outraged. The code of Omerta, sacred for generations, shattered by one man. Sammy received death threats. His family received death threats. Every mob family in America wanted him dead. But the government kept their end of the bargain. Despite admitting to 19 murders, Sammy Gravano was sentenced to just 5 years. He would serve less than 5 for 19 murders. Let that sink in. 1995. Karen Monthot. Niumda Seminoi. Bearwat. Sammy Gravano walked out of prison, a free man. Meshi Yebsigano. The government gave him a new identity, new social security number, new life. He moved to Arizona, as far from New York as possible. Witness protection. The deal was simple. Stay quiet, stay clean, stay alive. But for a man like Sammy, who had lived his entire life as a gangster, staying clean was never going to happen. Tempe, Arizona, 1995. I a college town, home to Arizona State University. 40,000 students, parties every weekend, and far, far away from the mob violence of New York. This was supposed to be Sammy's fresh start. A construction business, a quiet life, maybe coach his son's baseball team. That was the plan. But Sammy Gravano wasn't built for coaching baseball. He opened a swimming pool installation company. Called it Marathon Development. It was legitimate, legal, clean, and it was boring. Sammy had spent his entire life in the underworld, making fast money, taking risks, having power, and now he was installing pools. But something was happening in Tempe, something Sammy couldn't ignore. Arizona State University had become a party school, and the party drug of choice was ecstasy. MDMA, little pills, sold for $20 to $30 each. Kids were taking them by the thousands. Every weekend, every rave, every club. And Sammy, with his criminal mind, saw an opportunity. Ecstasy was perfect. It wasn't heroin. It wasn't cocaine. In the 1990s, law enforcement didn't understand it yet. The sentences were lighter. The heat was minimal. But the profits were enormous. A pill that cost $2 to make in Europe sold for $25 in Arizona. That's a markup any businessman could appreciate. And Sammy was always a businessman first. Late 1996. Missile, Mario, Ice-T, Transfer, MOBSTER. Sammy made a decision. He was going back into the game, not the Mafia. That world was over. But the drug trade, that was universal. He started small, reaching out to contacts, feeling out the market, learning the distribution networks. And soon, very soon, Sammy the Bull Gravano was back in business. Sammy didn't do this alone. He brought in his son, Gravano, only in his 20s, but raised in the life. Gerard understood his father's world, and he was ambitious. Together, they started recruiting kids from ASO, young dealers looking to make money, local distributors, and most importantly, Michael Papa, Sammy's right-hand man. D. Monumental, Missile, ESC Vendame, Yetalote. Bye-bye, John Gotti, his muscle, his enforcer. The operation was sophisticated, professional, organized like a corporation. Sammy used everything he learned from the mob. Compartmentalization. Nobody knew the full picture except him. Layers of dealers. So if one got caught, they couldn't bring down the whole organization. And most importantly, violence when necessary, to maintain control and respect. They called themselves the company. By 1997, they were moving thousands of pills a week. By 1998, MD, Mishao, Mises, Kaso, MBDSO, MT, Unvar, Dai, tens of thousands. The pills came from suppliers in California, transported to Arizona, then distributed through a network of college dealers. So, University of Arizona, parties, raves, nightclubs. The money was staggering. Conservative estimates put it at $2 million. In less than 2 years. Here's the irony. Sammy Gravano had betrayed John Gotti, brought down the Gambino family, destroyed the Mafia code to avoid life in prison. And now, he was building a criminal empire that would eventually land him right back where he started, behind bars. But this time, there would be no deal, no testimony, no walking away. The operation was massive. At its peak, Sammy's organization was moving 30,000 ecstasy pills a week. That's 1.5 million pills a year. At $25 per pill, we're talking about $37 million in revenue. For a man in witness protection, who was supposed to be invisible, Sammy Gravano had become very visible. But in the drug trade, success breeds competition. And competition breeds violence. By 1999, other distributors in Arizona noticed Sammy's operation. They wanted a piece. They wanted to move in. And Sammy wasn't sharing. One rival group thought they could muscle in, undercut Sammy's prices, steal his dealers, take his territory. Big mistake. These kids didn't know who they were dealing with. Sammy Gravano didn't become underboss of the Gambino family by backing down. He'd killed 19 men. These Arizona drug dealers were way out of their league. According to later testimony, Michael Papa, Sammy's enforcer, was sent to deliver messages. The kind of messages Sammy used to deliver in New York. One rival dealer was beaten severely. Another had his car torched. A third simply disappeared. The message was clear. This is our territory. Challenge us, and you'll regret it. This was Sammy's fatal flaw. He couldn't leave the violence behind. In the Mafia, violence was necessary. It was expected. It maintained order. But in Arizona, in witness protection, violence attracted attention. And attention was the one thing Sammy couldn't afford. By late 1999, the FBI was getting reports. Strange patterns of ecstasy distribution. Violence connected to drug deals. Names coming up. Names that shouldn't exist. Because Salvatore Gravano was supposed to be dead, or at least invisible. But here he was, operating a massive criminal enterprise, using violence to maintain control, like he'd never left New York, like he'd learned nothing. The FBI started surveillance. They watched Sammy's house. They tapped phones. They followed his associates. And slowly, piece by piece, they built a case against the most famous mob turncoat in American history, who'd broken the sacred code, served minimal time, and immediately went back to crime. The irony was not lost on them. February 24th, 2000. And Biden, 5-0 and federal agents surrounded Sammy Gravano's home in Tempe, Arizona. They had warrants, they had evidence, they had recordings, And they had patience. They'd been watching for months, building an airtight case. This time, there would be no deals, no testimony, no walking away. The raids were massive. 47 people arrested, including Sammy, his son Gerard, his wife Deborah, and Michael Papa. They seized hundreds of thousands of ecstasy pills, cash, weapons, records of the entire operation. The FBI called it Operation Twisted Truth, an appropriate name for a man who'd made his name by twisting the truth. The evidence was overwhelming. Wiretaps of Sammy discussing distribution, testimony from dealers who'd worked for him, financial records showing millions moving through front companies, video surveillance, everything the FBI needed. And this time, unlike with Gotti, Sammy had nothing to trade, no one to testify against. The government already knew everything he knew. He was useless. The trial began in 2001. The prosecution laid out the entire operation. The pills, the money, the violence. They called it the largest ecstasy distribution ring in Arizona history. They estimated over 30,000 pills distributed weekly, millions of dollars in profits. And at the center of it all, Sammy, the Bull Gravano, the man who'd once taken down the Gambino family, now facing the rest of his life in prison. October 2002. The jury deliberated for just a few hours. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to distribute ecstasy, money laundering, leading a criminal enterprise. Sammy Gravano, the most notorious turncoat in Mafia history, was going back to prison. This time, for 20 years, at 57 years old. He would be in his late 70s before release, if he lived that long. But here's what's remarkable. During sentencing, Sammy showed no remorse. He told the judge, "I was a gangster my whole life. I can't change who I am." No excuses, no apologies, just honesty. Perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said. He was a criminal. Always had been. Always would be. Witness protection. New identity. None of it mattered. Because you can change a man's name, his location, his circumstances. But you can't change his nature. Sammy Gravano served 17 years. He was released in 2017. And Cholis MOBSTER Anikawentas Acta at 72 years old. A lifetime in the criminal underworld. 19 murders admitted. A mafia empire betrayed. An ecstasy operation destroyed. And for what? Today, Sammy Gravano lives quietly. Reportedly in the Southwest, he's on YouTube, telling his stories. His podcast gets millions of views. People fascinated by the mob, by his life, by the contradictions. The man who broke the sacred code, who betrayed John Gotti, who admitted to 19 murders, is now a content creator. The 21st century is strange, but the Gravano case raises bigger questions about the witness protection program, about justice, about whether someone who admits to 19 murders should walk free after 5 years. The government argues that Sammy's testimony was invaluable. It destroyed the Gambino family, convicted dozens of mobsters, ended an era of organized crime. But critics point out, Sammy served 5 years for 19 murders, then immediately returned to crime, built a massive drug operation, made millions, and served 20 years for that. So, he served 5 years per murder, but 20 years for selling pills. Does that make sense? Is that justice? Or is it just business? The ecstasy epidemic of the late 1990s and early 2000s was devastating. Thousands of young people addicted, emergency rooms flooded, deaths from overdoses or tainted pills. Sammy's operation contributed to that. Those pills went to college kids, teenagers, people who thought they were just having fun at a rave, not buying from a former Mafia underboss who'd killed 19 people. The rivalry that brought Sammy down wasn't with other mobsters. It was with small-time drug dealers in Arizona. People who didn't know his history, didn't respect his reputation, and couldn't be controlled by the old rules. Because in Arizona, Sammy wasn't the bull. He was just another drug dealer. And that he couldn't accept. Sammy Gravano's story is an American tragedy. A man born into violence, who found success in crime, who betrayed everything he claimed to believe in for freedom, and then couldn't handle freedom, because freedom without power, without action, without the game, wasn't really freedom at all. It was just a different kind of prison. They say you can take the man out of the mob, but you can't take the mob out of the man. Sammy the Bull Gravano proved that in the most expensive way possible, he had everything: freedom, safety, a new life. All he had to do was nothing. Just be quiet, be normal, be ordinary. But Sammy Gravano was never ordinary. He was a killer, a strategist, a gangster. For 40 years, that's who he was. And 5 years in witness protection wasn't going to change that. The ecstasy empire he built wasn't about the money. He had money. It was about the game. The thrill, the power, the feeling of being in control. The rivalry with local dealers wasn't business. It was pride. In New York, Sammy was feared, respected. When someone challenged him, they disappeared. In Arizona, these kids didn't fear him. They didn't even know who he was. And that was intolerable. So he responded the only way he knew how, with violence. And violence brought the FBI. And the FB sent him back to prison. There's a lesson in Sammy's story about human nature, about addiction, not to drugs, but to a lifestyle. Sammy was addicted to crime, to the excitement, to the power. Testifying against John Gotti, that was easy. It was strategic self-preservation. But leaving the criminal life behind, that was impossible, because it wasn't just what he did. It was who he was. The American dream says, anyone can change. Anyone can start over. Anyone can become someone new. Sammy Gravano proves that's not always true. Some people are shaped by their circumstances. their choices, their actions, so deeply that redemption isn't possible. Change isn't possible. They are who they are. And who Sammy was is a gangster. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, always. Sammy the Bull Gravano, the man who betrayed the biggest mob boss in America, brought down the Gambino crime family, admitted to 19 murders, walked free, and then did it all over again. Different crime, same criminal. Because in the end, we are all prisoners of our own nature. And Sammy's nature was always and will always be a gangster.